Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jen Gilliman. I'm the Interim Director of the School of Visual Arts, and I welcome you to the Contemporary Perspective Lecture Series. I'm going to start with a bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so sorry about that. This is being recorded, so after about an hour-long talk from Walton Ford.
I'm not sure if they have this. Do you have the mic here? Is this on now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just wanted to double check. I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
That's awkward.
Okay. So this is being recorded. There's going to be a talk for an hour, and after the hour, we have two volunteers, Gabby and Taylor, who will be coming around with microphones, and we'll have time for a Q&A. We ask that you wait until you get the microphone so we can hear you, since this is being recorded. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Walton Ford. Walton Ford is a painter and printmaker whose imaginative yet highly realistic images of animals draw from the tradition and natural history painting. Though working in the style of such luminaries as John James Audubon, Ford subverts expectations through strange interplay between species, creating a riotous carnival of violence and sensuality, power, and playfulness. His meticulously rendered watercolors, often produced on a massive scale, reveal as much about human nature as they do of the animal kingdom, forming a sort of visual treatise on the abundance of appetites that rule our baser selves. Ford's work, as he once described it, envisions a cultural history of the way animals live in the human imagination. Ford's work has been exhibited across the country and internationally at sites including the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum in Berlin, the List Visual Arts Center at MIT, and is currently on view as a solo exhibition at the Musée de la Chaise de la Nature in Paris. He is the recipient of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, among others. Please join me in welcoming Walton Ford.
Hello. I guess, oh yeah, I'm mic'd or something like that. Anyway, it's all good. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the kind words. Hi, everybody. Let's see, I guess I'll start talking about my work. I make very large-scale watercolors on paper. They're watercolor gouache and India ink on paper. And I get all my ideas from things I read. Almost all my ideas I get from books. They're sort of literary sources. And I read a variety of things. I read natural history books, obviously, but just general history, popular history books. I read lots of literature, novels, memoirs. I visit museums of natural history. I read the kind of zookeepers' manuals, things that are anything to do with like trapping animals, hunting animals. Because what I'm interested in is this sort of intersection between people and wild animals, particularly, not domestic ones. Wild animals interest me because they didn't choose to have to deal with us. Domestic animals made a bargain with us a long time ago. All domestic animals chose human beings as company as much as they chose, it's a reciprocal thing. Like pigs moved into towns to eat the garbage that we cast aside rather than live out in the forest looking for things to eat. So we made a relationship with domestic animals that was reciprocal. Wild animals, on the other hand, have to deal with us when they're trying to run away or hide from us or whatever. So I was interested in how those relationships work. And I was always interested in that ever since I was a little kid. So my practice is really I was an art student once, and I tried to study film. I thought I wanted to make film because when I would go to films, I would be emotionally engaged. I cried in films. I hid my eyes. I yelled when they cut the woman's eyeball in a chien andalou. I did everything that you do in the movies, and I thought that's the great art form that I need to plug into, and that's the great narrative tradition we have. But the thing is, I sucked as a filmmaker. I couldn't figure it out. I didn't understand the equipment. The kids who loved it spent all day in the editing room, and I wasn't one of those kids, but I drew and I painted and I hiked in the woods, and I kept exotic pets in my room when I was a kid, and so I realized that this was what I needed to do eventually. Anyhow, this is a painting called Falling Bough that I did. It's about the passenger pigeon, which was the most numerous bird on Earth. When they lived, they were a wild dove, basically, a lot like a mourning dove, and when the flocks passed overhead, it might take 6 days for them to pass overhead. There were literally billions and billions of these birds in North America. They ate the nuts in the forest that blanketed the East Coast from the Mississippi all the way up and down the coast. They ate acorns and chestnuts and things like that. So when that region was deforested, and after many, many years of intensive hunting, the last passenger pigeon died in a zoo in 1914. Her name was Martha. And anyhow, so this huge mass extinction happened, and I was interested in the written descriptions at the time of what it was like to be around these birds, and it was almost always terrifying. And when they would land in a forest, the branches, the weight of the birds could actually break branches off. Audubon, the natural history painter, wrote about this. So I wanted to do a picture of this branch that had broken off under the weight of the birds. But what I then like to do on top of my research is I've made it a sort of, there's like a passenger pigeon raping its young, there's passenger pigeons stealing each other's eggs, murdering each other, there's gluttony happening where they're eating way too many. There's every sin imaginable is happening on this thing. It's like a ship of fools. And I wanted to make a blame the victim picture, basically. It's like they had it coming. They're disgusting. You know, fuck it, they're extinct. It's great, you know. So it's like the way our minds work. I wanted to make positive propaganda for killing passenger pigeons, you know. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, the kind of thing I'm trying to do. It's like read up on something, get to be really an expert on it as best you can as a lay person, and like get your mind around the problem, come up with some sort of visual solution that's striking. A narrative is always important for me. And then a title that isn't exactly contained in the image, because a lot of people think of this as a floating branch even, and so I just call it Falling Bough. And then, you know, I don't know, that's sort of it. That's kind of, and then obsessive work, like that nobody else would tackle. So this is a watercolor on paper that's about 10 feet by 5 feet. Anyway, I wish I'd kept it, because I'm not going to make another. So here's another. This was one of a series I did. There was a small paragraph I read in a biography of the British explorer and adventurer Sir Richard Burton. Not Richard Burton, who was with Elizabeth Taylor, but Richard Burton in the 19th century, who was an explorer, an African explorer, and a great genius. He was he spoke like 30 languages, and he was an incredible fencer, and he could beat you in chess with a blindfold on, and people hated this guy. He was impossible. And when he was a young officer in India, he was said to keep over 30 monkeys in his barracks, and he said he learned the monkey language. He had over 60 monkey words written down, and because he was this great linguist, that somehow got lost in a fire, so we don't have that anymore. And he nicknamed all his monkeys. He had one that he called his aide-de-camp, one that he called his doctor, one that he called his lawyer, you know, every kind of functionary, right? So they all took on these sort of pompous British attitudes, but he had one that he called his wife, and he gave her little pearl earrings, and he sat her in a high chair at dinner, and they all sat at table with him, and they had their dinner. So I was very interested in this idea that when we keep monkeys as pets, we always anthropomorphize them, and we always make them into sort of court jesters, and we never allow them just to be monkeys. Whenever we're looking at a monkey in the zoo, we're looking at a sort of reflection of ourselves, and it's the most direct kind of version of that because of how much DNA we share with them. So in this case, I sort of have them starting out like the wife is looking at Indian pornographic paintings, and the sort of doctor is fussing with the aide-de-camp or whatever, and they're all kind of keeping to their roles a bit, but then eventually they just act like monkeys and they stop being metaphors, and they're off. So, and I call it the sensorium because I was thinking about those 19th century guys that knew everything. You know, there was these guys like Humboldt and Sir Richard Burton that pretty much knew the scope of human knowledge in the 19th century. It was almost possible to do that then. And now, of course, you know, you can't know everything there is to know, and we know that just from the quickest search on the internet. But in the 19th century, you could sort of have a library of Western knowledge and think that you knew almost everything. And he was one of those guys where all the senses are engaged. So then a lot of people make comparisons with Audubon in my work because stylistically, well, because a lot of people, the only natural history artist they know is Audubon. There's that. So anyway, he's been somebody that I've thought about a lot. And this is kind of almost a direct borrowing from an Audubon painting he did of a golden eagle. Audubon's painting of a golden eagle, he's soaring up in a very similar way. But the story behind how Audubon got that eagle specimen is interesting because people he was in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and people around, the farmers and stuff, knew that there was this whack job buying specimens. So a farmer brought him a golden eagle he had caught in a fox trap, like the eagle had come down for the bait in the fox trap and got it on just one toe. And because those birds are so powerful, he dragged the sort of log and the trap for over 2 miles. The farmer found the eagle still completely fine, and he brought it to Audubon. So Audubon thought, wow, I have a perfect specimen. His way of working was to kill the bird and then pose it like a butterfly by pinning it on a sheet of wood and then draw from that. But in this case, he had such a perfect specimen, he didn't want to mess up its feathers or anything, so he tried to smoke it to death by putting it in a smokehouse, and he left it there for like many, many days, and every time he'd open the door, the thing would just be staring at him. It was fine. Nothing was having any effect. And so he put sulfur on the flames until he said the smell was unsupportable, and finally he got so kind of pissed off that he drove a metal stake into the bird's heart, and then he took 2 weeks to do the drawing and painting, and by the end of it, he fell sick. He got some horrible, like, grip, you know. He had some weird word for it. I forget what it was, like consumptive, this and that. But he fell into a delirium himself. So I thought, like, the bird in the smokehouse was probably in some sort of delirium. Audubon was in this sort of delirium. They both were in this complete weird headspace. So I came up with this vision of all of the martyrdom. It's like a saint, you know, with all the visions of his martyrdom. He's got the trap, the smoke is pouring out of his mouth, the stake is driven into his heart, but he's getting away from Audubon, who's then collapsed in the snow. So it's either Audubon's delirium that you're seeing or the birds. Either way, it doesn't matter. And so, yeah, this is an important picture to me just because it gets all the stuff that it gets at the stuff I'm trying to talk about, you know? Here's another sort of bird metaphor. I went to Cuba before I was allowed. So I went up to Montreal, and I illegally flew to Cuba when George Bush was president, half hoping I would get caught, you know? Like, it would make me so famous, you know? I wanted to do paintings about this bird they had down there. They had a macaw. They had their own macaw in Cuba, and it's extinct now. I'm very interested in extinct birds. And there's only like 4 specimens, and there's a lot of cloak and dagger about where the specimens are. It's really kind of amazing. But there's so few stuffed birds left. But the Cuban macaw looked like this. It was called the Cuban Red Macaw, and I thought, wow, communism, it's so cool. It's red. So I decided by going down to Cuba and traveling around and taking a lot of photographs and seeing what it was like, and I came back and I wanted to do a series of paintings about using the Cuban red macaw, who was a doomed bird, to tell the story of the Cuban Revolution. So there's a great Cuban poet called José Martí, who was one of the martyrs of the revolution way before Castro and all those guys in the 19th century. Trying to liberate from Spain. And I realized that they were sort of half in love with these like lost causes and these sort of doomed poets and these romantic figures. And so I wanted to do this painting. I did a series of these red macaw paintings, but this is one called The Poet. And he's just sort of, he's been snared, he's been caught in a trap, but he's saying, the country is not a pedestal, it's, or whatever he says. He says some sort of patriotic thing, I can't remember. You can't see the text coming out, but he's saying to maintain some sort of purity in the revolution or something. Yeah. Yeah, the country is a spirit, not a pedestal or something like this. So then, let me see. This is one of these sort of dreamlike images that just come from taking two different things. As young students of art, there's a really great documentary that is about Bob Dylan, and it shows, it's called No Direction Home, but it shows him as a young artist trying to create his work. And basically, he likes American folk music, and then he likes beat poetry. And when he puts beat poetry together with American folk music, it's like some sort of plutonium. It explodes in his garage, basically, and takes over the whole world and changes everything. Sometimes you put two disparate things together, and you get this huge reaction. And sometimes you just put two things together, and you get something in your studio that you like. But basically, all of you are doing that in one way or another. It's like, I have this interest, this one, this one, this one. If I put them all together, what do I get? And that's kind of the way we make art. It's not like we come up with something completely new. We take all these old things and put them together. So anyway, I found a little print of this. It was from George Catlin, and he was an American frontier artist. He went out and did images of the Indians in the 1840s before the whole settling of the West. And he drew this scene of this old bison being torn apart by these prairie wolves. And the prairie wolves in those days were often white and big. And so it was all these white wolves around this one bison with his eyes torn out and his tongue torn out. And all, and Catlin actually saw this poor bison and finally shot him, put him out of his misery, seeing him being attacked by these wolves. And I don't know, I was spending a lot of time in Europe at the time, and I was in these formal gardens, like in places like Versailles and stuff, and I thought how that image of nature in Europe, and especially in France, was like to trim the hedge into a perfect little thing and have a little wall around it. And then I thought, like, our idea of nature, like Yellowstone or something, is also a sort of walled garden. And anyway, I just put the two images together, like, here's the American vision of nature, and here's the French vision of nature, and I call it Le Jardin, and it's just this sort of demented scene. I don't even know what it means. I think it was painted around the time they were saying things like freedom fries and stuff like that when they were... It might have had something to do with that. But I just like this sort of dreamlike, things erupting in the wrong place. And it's sort of, I feel like that when I'm in France. I feel like I'm an American tourist. I'm making a big stink. I'm like making a mess. I'm bleeding all over the, it's like you're making, you order food wrong, you can't drink your coffee now, that kind of thing. This is another extinct animal, lots of extinct animals in this slideshow. This is a really big painting. It's bigger than it is on this screen. In real life, it's about 18 feet by like 9, 10 feet high. It's a triptych. In the end, it was framed in 3 separate dark frames, but it just makes it feel like you're looking through a window. These are animals called thylacines, and thylacines were a marsupial wolf-like creature that lived in Tasmania. They would have eaten kangaroos, but when the first settlers arrived, they thought, oh my God, they're going to eat our sheep. There were sheep farmers in Tasmania. So they just set about trapping them and killing them and hunting them with dogs. And in 50 years, they'd gotten rid of them all. My idea, again, was another sort of blame the victim thing. I decided to do more like if you were a malarial Tasmanian sheep farmer and you were having a nightmare, this might be what it looked like. It would be like, island biogeography is one of those things where animals on islands go extinct at a much higher rate than animals anywhere else. So I decided to make an island out of extinct animals. and have them doing just what we wish they wouldn't. Like they're killing our cute little lambykins, you know? And they're sinking beneath the sea. It's like this doomed image of extinction. But they're really cool animals. They can open their mouths really wide. And as a technical thing, I went and I go to the Museum of Natural History and I draw the stuffed specimens of these things. There's video of these things walking around in cages, so I did screen grabs of all the different positions. I sculpted the head of one of these things because they're so freaking weird, and then I held it in all these different directions. I bought little plastic animal versions of them. So, you know, like I immersed myself in trying to figure out how these things functioned in space, you know? And then I look at things like the raft of the Medusa for inspiration, like how do you paint? These are very classically, like I'm really interested in Renaissance and 19th century Romantic painting, where you have a lot of intertwining figures and you have a lot of drama in that way, and learning how those kinds of things interact and lock. So like I spent my senior year in Italy drawing from the frescoes and things. And then oh man, I've always loved the original 1933 version of King Kong. That's my favorite. That has everything in it that I'm trying to get at. It's like the cultural fear of things wild. There's all kinds of racism in that thing. There's like just screwed up attitudes from just, I mean, every kind of, oh, it's so good. It's unbelievable. It's such a great document of the cultural misapprehension of everything that isn't happening in the white Western world. Like just the complete missing the boat in every way. Like, we're going to make $1 million, you know, like this is going to be great. And then at the center of it is this stalker, King Kong, who like, he holds the girl the entire time she's screaming to get away, and it's like he's just in ecstasy, like having this tiny little creature in his hand that he loves so much. So I wanted to make it, I wanted him to go through the stages of grief. I wanted King Kong to go through sort of the stages of grief and get over it. So in this one, he's in the denial stage still, as you can see. He's like, how can you not love me? You know, I'm 40 feet tall. I love you. Like, why isn't this working? You know? And then he's in the rage stage. This is like the bad boyfriend stuff, right? He's crying, but he's fucking furious. He's like, you gotta love me. You know, and this is like, yeah, so. And then here's acceptance. He's gonna be okay, you know? He's gonna be okay. And I painted these life size, so these paintings are watercolor on paper, but they're not 9 feet by 12 feet. They're like small movie screens, like King Kong would have been shown on, and they're based on screen grabs from the movie. But then what I did is I also, if you see the actual face in the movies, of course it's made, it's this puppet that's rather awkward. So I really fleshed him out in a sort of anatomically credible way, like as if he had real bone structure instead of this sort of claymation-y face that he has, you know? Yeah, oh, the poor guy. So from an imaginary ape to a real ape, then I was talking before the lecture. I'm friends with this guy, Bob Thurman, and he's this sort of Buddhist, he runs the Tibet Center in New York, and he's cool. And he said to me, and I thought, I thought he was this wacko mystic when he said it, but he said, you've been incarnated on the planet to speak for these animals. Like you're only a vessel for the animals to communicate through you and tell their side of the story and this and that. And I was like, you're whatever. That's cool. Let's move on. But I sat down and I really thought about it, and I thought, well, what would that mean if that was really true? So then I was doing research about this gorilla called Susie. Susie was the first female gorilla to come to the United States, and she flew as a publicity stunt on the first class on the Graf Zeppelin, which later became a Nazi Zeppelin. So she flew from Germany to New York on this Nazi airship, first class cabin. I thought about what she had been through. She was trapped, obviously. Her parents would have had to be killed because that's how you capture young gorillas. You can't take them away from their parents willingly. So you shoot the parents, you take the babies, you transport them across West Africa to some steamship. She had to be then brought to Europe. Then from Europe, she was put on this Zeppelin, then flown to the United States, and then she ended up in a zoo in the Midwest. So her journeys were completely traumatic. You know, there wouldn't have been anything first class about how she felt about what she was going through. So I tried to really channel her way of thinking about her trip. So I wrote, let's see, it says, I no longer feel like biting. All the strangeness has made me very tired. The people here have flat faces the color of tongues. You know, it just goes on like that. And she talks about this weird sweet fruit that they're giving her to eat, that she's in these hard shelters where it never rains. And she remembers being on her mother's back and going through the green and the wet. And she just says, the people feed me soft, sweet food and they watch me while I eat it. And so she's just sort of doing that survival thing of like traumatized victims of war, or, you know, just whatever, refugees. Like she's like another refugee, you know. And she survived. She ended up living to be in her 50s in this zoo all by herself. But she engaged herself. She did a lot of tricks. She learned to ride the bicycle, and she went along with the program. She got up on the bike. She wore the weird costumes. She posed for the photographers. She didn't bite anybody. She didn't kill anybody. So then this is one of the paintings that's in Paris right now. And I have a show in this museum called the Musée de la Chasse, which is the Museum of Hunting. And it's about the aristocratic hunting traditions in Europe, like hunting to the hounds. So it's full of beautiful tapestries and triumphal pictures of people on horseback successfully hunting wolves and this and that and killing all the animals in Europe, stags and everything. And there's taxidermy and weapons and all this wonderful stuff in this museum. And it's a beautiful 18th century museum, so I love this place. But I wanted to, when they asked me to do a show there, I filled their museum with paintings that were sort of hunts gone wrong. And this is one of the great hunts that went wrong. This is based on this story that they call the Beast of Gévaudan. And the Beast of Gévaudan was basically, there were wolf attacks in 18th century France in the countryside in this Gévaudan region. And the local people started just calling it in general like a beast or a monster that was killing their children, because the girls, young girls, would go out with the flocks and they would get attacked as well as the sheep. The sheep would get attacked, but also the little girls would get attacked, and they were the shepherdesses, you know. And the press got a hold of it in Paris, and they started writing about a monster attacking young girls in France. And of course, then there'd be an etching of a girl falling over with her breast out, and it would be all sexy, and the beast would be this big, hairy, crazy thing that didn't look like a wolf at all. And then the aristocrats got on board, and they said, well, we'll go down and hunt the beast. And so the aristocrats, at that time, the peasantry wasn't allowed to arm themselves. This is pre-revolutionary France, around 1760. So the people were not allowed to trap or hunt at all on the land where their children were being killed. The aristocrats went down, and they were like galloping around in farmers' fields and making a big mess of things. And of course, they weren't killing any beasts. They got a couple of wolves because there wasn't any beast. But they went back to France, and back to Paris, and said, oh, I got 6 shots off, and it was 10 feet long, and it's a supernatural creature. There's no way to kill it. And because that would cover up their failure to kill it. So the press, the aristocrats, the peasants themselves, they all created this imaginary beast. If you go to Gévaudan now and say, like, what was attacking people in the 18th century? They say, a beast. There was a beast here. Like, dead serious. They're not kidding. There was a huge beast here. And I'm like, there was only a pack of wolves, but you don't want to get into that argument with people. So this is the creation of the beast. I used a lot of sort of 18th century pornographic tropes. So the aristocrat is here. He's gone down to hunt. He got himself a wolf. As a little reward, he's given money to the peasant girl so he can have sex with her. They're having their sex and creating this beast who's come out of the forest with a big erection to kill them both. And it's the conception and the birth of the beast of Gévaudan all coming together at this one moment in this sort of hysterical, so I have a quote from the Marquis de Sade above the aristocrat's head that talks about how imagination is the great fuel for all his pleasures. And then there's a quote above the girl's head from Voltaire where he says, unbidden, imagination run wild, it creates the kind of fear that helps us oppress our fellow man. So it's the two sides of unbridled imagination. And then that was the first painting. This was the first painting you see when you go in the museum. Then I scatter a whole bunch of paintings throughout the museum, through their collection. And then the last painting you see is this one where the beast is triumphant. He's killed the truth, which is the wolf. The wolf is actually what was causing all the problem to begin with. The sort of aristocrat and the peasant girl, they're asleep. They're gone anyway. They're not even remembered. That's not, the revolution came and swept it all away. But what remains is this sort of our own sick vision of nature, our own fear, our own terror of what's out there that we don't understand. So, and then I just painted this, I don't know, this is what was in my studio a short time ago. And I'm doing a little series of paintings about a female Black Panther who lived in the Zurich Zoo in the 1930s. 1933, she was captured and she was put in a small cage, and then she was put in a cage with another Black Panther who they were supposed to mate, but she got in a fight with her mate, and so they separated them. They put her in a separate cage, and she escaped. She found her way out through a little heating duct, and she was loose in the Swiss countryside for 10 weeks in 1933 in the dead of winter. A tropical cat in the deep snow in Switzerland on the eve of the Second World War. I thought, man, this looks like a Walton Ford painting to me. So that's Zurich in the background. She's just gotten loose. She's a little bit of blood from her wound that she got from her supposed boyfriend that she didn't like so much. And she's just gotten out. She's trying to figure out where to go. I'm going to do a little series of paintings about her. And she was gone for 10 weeks. They had, clairvoyance trying to find out where she was. She was reported everywhere, all over Europe. The zoo got huge attendance figures. And then finally some peasant, it was like the Depression, some peasant found her under a barn and shot her for food. That's what it said in the zookeeper's manual I read, just like a peasant found her under a barn and shot her for food. And that was it. That's the end of that story. And then he moved on. This was from a zookeeper's manual about escapes. And I don't know, amazing story. So that's it. That's all I'm going to show you. And then I could open it up for questions. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
So we'll open it up for questions.
So that first person is the brave one that gets their hand up. Amazing. Doesn't anyone have a question? Yeah, good. Oh, wait, we have to wait for the microphone because we're making a movie.
After all the research you did on Audubon, did you decide you didn't like him very much based on the way he treated animals?
I mean, not based on the way he treated animals as much. I mean, yeah, some of that, because he did a lot of hunting that wasn't, how can I say, the apologists who just want to always paint him as somebody wonderful will point out that, he had to shoot the animals to paint them, and that's exactly true. But I've read accounts of him shooting birds off the decks of ships. He shot animals alongside the riverboats, just on the bank, just let them fall. He was a marksman, and he was a gun nut. I mean, he was more than just, there were guys at the exact same time like Thoreau or Emerson. It wasn't like he was purely a man of his times. He was also, even by his standards, pretty bloodthirsty, and he loved to hunt. He describes raking up the birds on a beach that he had shot into something that looked like a haystack. you know, these guys like to shoot hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of birds a day, and animals as well. So it's not entirely fair just to say, but he's also, he can be charming in his writings, but he can be really obnoxious too, and really defensive and self-aggrandizing, and he's sort of a pathological liar a lot of times. If he was in Europe, he would act like he was like this frontiersman, but when he was in the United States, he would act like he was from, you know, the lost nobility of France, you know, like, oh, I had titles, you know, my family. And he was actually the bastard son of a ship captain, you know. His mom was from Haiti, and his dad was a ship captain, and he was raised in France by his father's wife in France, but his mom was back in Haiti. So he made up stories about himself. You know, he wasn't the most enlightened guy. You know, he was the opposite of an abolitionist. He was a defender of slavery. You know, he wasn't a great human being, you know, but he made some cool paintings of birds and animals, you know.
One quick question. Richard Burton, was that
Yes,
his
Sir
name?
Richard Burton, yeah.
You said he dressed the monkey in pearls,
Yeah.
and acted like she was his wife.
Mm-hmm.
What did his real wife think about that?
Well, he wasn't married at the time. He didn't get married until he was in his middle age, and Isabel Burton was an interesting character in her own right. She was like 18, and he was like 45, and she was just like, I'm gonna marry that guy, and she just like kind of set her sights on it. And the only bummer about it is he translated a lot of pornographic literature from language to language, and she got rid of a lot of stuff. She did a lot of diary burning because she was Catholic after his death. So that was the only bummer about Isabel. Otherwise, a pretty amazing woman who went out with him on horseback and did all this crazy stuff. Yeah. Oh, here, the mic is headed your way, I'm sure of it. There's a hand up right there. Oh, look at that. Wow, cooperative.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between your paintings and your prints, your printmaking. Does it?
Yeah, I mean, because I sort of ape the sort of natural history traditions of the 19th century, all those guys like Audubon or Catlin or Bodmer or Edward Lear or different people that did natural history work or exploration type of illustration, they often did their field work in watercolor on paper like this, and then they went home and made etchings or lithographs or prints from their explorations, you know? So the relationship was already a sort of historic lock for my project. It's kind of like I'm using the language of the age of exploration to talk about that time and the issues they raise about our approach towards nature and things we don't understand. And so it made sense to use the different languages that would have been used throughout history to talk about those things. So my prints are done. I do copperplate etching, and I work with Peter Pettingill, who's here in the front row, and we're going to do a little talk tomorrow. And we create prints that have that feel. They look like historic documents, like the way these do, but they're twisted. And the other thing I do with the prints is I don't make miniature versions of my paintings or lesser versions. I really hate that in the fine art world, where like if you can't afford a real one, you could get the print. You know, it's that kind of thing that happens all the time. The printmaking that I love they're like Rembrandt. The prints exist as prints. They're not knockoffs of the paintings. The prints are a completely beautiful thing unto themselves, and that's what we do. I only make prints that exist as discrete objects of their own. I think that's important to do, and not sort of do it as a lucrative side thing, you know, like for the poor people. I hate all. I mean, it makes you want to puke. Yeah. And you see it a lot at print fairs, like, oh, that's cool. That's like a knockoff of a painting. And that just seems cheesy to me. So the prints take longer than anything else, and they're so labor intensive, and they're just insanely worked out as objects. And they're actually what seems to sell to museums more than my watercolors, because museums don't want to peel for big pieces of work. They're cheap. And they can get my prints, and the prints are quite beautiful and exhibitable, and also just go into storage where they put everybody. Anyway, yeah. So that's how I got into big public collections. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So a lot of your work can kind of be seen as allegory for kind of imperialist history, especially like your series featuring European starlings. And you haven't really spoken to that, and I'm wondering if you kind of see yourself as engaging in that history from a sort of social justice-y perspective, or do you think of yourself from like a social justice perspective, or like if you think of yourself as an activist artist in any way?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it happens simply because the subject that I'm so interested in, which is this sort of intersection between like the sort of what we consider like wild animals or nature and human culture, because that in itself is a violent history, and because first contacts are often the most violent moments, and it'll engage in these issues, but I try to keep the didactic aspects of it to a minimum if I can, and because I don't want to make a political cartoon out of it or something. I don't want it to read so quickly, you know, so that you have one take. One of the things that, because it can go either way, you know, like there's a great Peter Sheldall critique of Norman Rockwell in which he says, you know, when you look at a Norman Rockwell picture, you know, the kid is there, he's opened the drawer, and there's a Santa Claus outfit spilling out, and it's his dad's drawer, you know, and the kid's like, and it's like he just found out there's no Santa Claus. There's no other read of that painting at all. You can only see it Norman Rockwell's way. You can't see it any other way. And it takes all the air out of the room in a funny way. Like, and every one of his paintings is like that. So I knew that a lot of political art that's really good, engages in these issues, is also sort of open in a weird way. Like the Raft of the Medusa, which is a big social critique of the aristocratic system in France at that time. You know, this was like, I don't know if you know the story of it, but it's like there's shipwreck and yeah, right. So, but when you look at it, it's also just it's about a lot of stuff. It opens up. It's a nightmare all by itself. It sort of isn't. It doesn't. You don't even have to know. I didn't know the story for years. I mean, most people don't. They look at it and it's just this overwhelming experience to look at this painting of these people lost at sea. So that's what I'm hoping for when I do it right. I hope that it opens it up a bit and doesn't feel like this is a critique of, you know, like, it just feels, like that makes me feel worried, you know? So that's all, yeah. But it ends up touching on it a lot because, wow, extinct animals, I'm so interested in that, you know, that's a brutal history, you know.
So these are obviously very large paintings. What drew you to the medium of watercolor? Because I am not used to seeing watercolors this large.
So what
drew you to watercolor?
Oh, what drew me to watercolor? Yeah. So like when I initially when I was like a little kid, I loved drawing animals, and I thought I was going to be a traditional natural history illustrator. I thought I was going to like be some sort of ranger in a national park, like that sat around and drew or something. I had this imaginary idea of myself as a sort of outdoorsman, naturalist person, you know, Jeremiah Johnson with a sketch pad. And it obviously, then I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and then there was like theory and all of this kind of stuff happening. But when I was little, I did do watercolors of animals, and I felt really comfortable doing it. Then I tried to be a filmmaker, and I painted in oils, and I did everything that you do when you're at art school. And when I emerged from it, I sort of returned to sort of stuff that I was doing, that I was comfortable with when I was young. The other thing is like we often have contempt for what we're really good at. And I was particularly good draftsperson. Like, you know, I could draw when I was really young at a pretty high level. So what I've decided to do is make it really hard for me. Like if you're good at drawing and making watercolors of animals, you're suddenly not that good if it's a sheet of paper that's 12 feet by 9 feet and it's going to be King Kong's head. Like, and I'm up on a scaffold trying to paint his eyeball. All of a sudden, I'm like, I'm in over my head now. Like, I made this hard for myself. So that's what I do is I take what I'm, instead of having contempt for what you're good at, which a lot of young people in this room are going to do that. They're going to be like, there's something that you're really good at that you think, yeah, you know, and you've just put it aside. But what I really want to do, that was what I did with the film. What I really want to do, I want to be Martin Scorsese. And it's like, you're not going to be Martin Scorsese. You're going to be, but, so I had contempt for what I was good at until I made what I was good at really difficult for myself. And I continue to do that. And even this painting was somehow hard for me to, because I wanted the shadow to be just right. You know, like it's like I had to figure this one out a little bit before I painted it. You know, it's like every new work is a challenge for me, you know. So that's what drew me to watercolor. It's also the language of natural history art. Since Durer's rabbit in 1515 or something, the way he painted that rabbit is the same way I painted this, except he painted better than me. But it's the same technique, you know. It's the same way of laying on like little highlights of gouache over a watercolor wash, you know. So anyway, it's the language of like recording nature on the fly. So I thought, what a perfect way to tell my story.
You don't have to do it if you don't want to. But,
Okay, Richard.
you didn't show an image of your big elephant painting.
Oh, I didn't, and I don't have it here.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you would talk about the narrative without most of the people in the room knowing about it.
Wow. Yeah, I got tired of that elephant. It's the biggest thing I ever made, but then I thought that my narratives got, like, when I painted this painting of an elephant, and I tried to, this was what a lot of young artists do too. I tried to put everything I knew into that picture. I thought I didn't let myself off the hook. And now I realize I don't have to put every single thing I think I know into every single picture I make. You know, but at that time, so I made this life-size Indian elephant out of like many, many panels. It was 22 different paintings. They were all framed, but they fit together into one big rectangle and made this image of this elephant. I don't know if you can picture that. And then inside each frame was birds from the West, Western birds. This was an Asian elephant. Western birds doing various nefarious things. And then they were also landing on pressure points that you use to drive elephants to do things. If you were riding an Indian elephant and you had the stick that they used to control the elephant. So the pressure points were being landed on by birds from the West that were giving confusing signals to this giant elephant who was in must. And when male elephants are in must, they have these big, huge erections and they go crazy and kill people. So I had him raging and all the birds are trying to control him and they can't. So it was supposed to be this giant metaphor about my travels in India and Asia and how that's a juggernaut that Western people try to control and never can, and blah, 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 blah. And I mean, I had the Beatles in there. There were like 4 little nightingales that were flying around that were supposed to be the Beatles. George Harrison was on where the third eye on the elephant would be, and the other birds were flying away. I mean, it just went on and on and on. And I really did put everything I had into that painting. And then put it up and kind of didn't like it. I was like, oh, God, you know. And it got me on the map because when I was painting it, I was pretty unknown, and then there was a little bit of buzz. Like, there's this guy painting a life-size elephant on the floor of his studio because I didn't have a wall big enough. So I would get up on a ladder to look down at it. And I use a rear-view mirror to make it smaller sometimes so I could actually see the whole thing. And I never even saw it on the wall until the show opened. It just was this huge process. And the roof was leaking, and it was a watercolor, and it was just this big deal. So, I mean, I ended up with like Condé Nast people taking photos in my studio. It like made me famous. But I don't know. I didn't put it in. I got tired. That's it. Oh yeah, I'll let you. Wow, she's got the book. You wouldn't want me to sign that or anything, would you? Yeah. See, look at that thing, demented. So you could see why it took a while to paint it, because this is like maybe 20 feet, and this is like 15 feet, something like that. It's really huge.
That's a paper also?
All individual sheets of paper, individually framed, and it all locks together like a big jigsaw puzzle on the wall. But you could take each one out, and I wanted each one to function as its own little separate composition.
Did you account for the frame for it?
Oh my God, I accounted for everything. It was such a process making that thing. It took me almost a year to paint that thing. Yeah. It's owned by George Soros' family, actually, yeah. His daughter bought it, and it lives in a house in the Hudson Valley. The Soros family, they have a big compound there, and it lives in the compound. It's in a big ballroom, as you can imagine, a beautiful ballroom that was actually painted in colors after they install the elephant that match. Like, all the furniture is this sort of gray and pink, and I mean, it's unbelievable. I went in there and I was like, wow. Those folks have some dough, huh? But they're like good dough people, right? Yeah. Yay for George Soros and all, right? That's probably it, huh? Thank you so much.